This is Tom Duty, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Duty in a Google search for my site. LibriVox listeners, I know this is not being done according to the rules. The software that is required or suggested will not work for me given the operating system. This is my first attempt to get something accepted by LibriVox, and this experiment will determine if I do more. If it does make it and get approved and gets edited, I will do my best to say nothing when it reaches the blank points, like when I'm turning pages or if I get distracted. So, in theory, cutting out the silence will leave a fully edited audio of the text. So, in a second, I will begin with the LibriVox regimen, and I will not say anything else but the LibriVox regimen plus the text that I'm attempting. Chapter 6 of Celebrated Crimes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Duty, Celebrated Crimes, Volume 3, Alexandre Dumas, translated by Mary Stewart, Chapter 6. The Queen came out of her room only in the evening to take her place at the window which looked over the lake. At the usual time she saw the light of which henceforth her sole hope shine in the little house in Kinross. For a whole long month she had no other consolation than seeing it every night, fixed and faithful. At last, at the end of this time, and as she was beginning to despair of seeing George Douglas again, one morning on opening the window, she uttered a cry. Mary Satan ran to her, and the Queen, without having strength to speak, showed her in the middle of the lake in a tiny boat at anchor, and in the boat little Douglas and George, who were absorbed in fishing, their favorite amusement. The young man had arrived the day before, and as everyone was accustomed to his unexpected returns, the sentinel had not even blown the horn, and the Queen had known that at last a friend had come. However, she was 3 days yet without seeing this friend, otherwise than she had come just done, that is, on the lake. It is true that from morning till evening she did not leave that spot from which he could view the Queen's window and the Queen herself. When to gaze at the wider horizon, she leaned her face against the bars. At last, on the morning of the fourth day, the Queen was awakened by a great noise of dogs and horns. She immediately ran to the window, for to a prisoner everything is an event, and she saw William Douglas, who was embarking with a pack of hounds and some huntsmen. In fact, making a truce for the day with his gaoler's duties, to enjoy a pleasure more in harmony with his rank and birth. He was going to hunt in the woods which covered the last ridge of Ben Lemon, and which ever sinking died down on the banks of the lake. The queen trembled with delight, for she hoped that Lady Lochleven would maintain her ill will, and that then George would replace his brother. This hope was not disappointed. At the usual time, the queen heard the footsteps of those who were bringing her breakfast. The door opened, and she saw George Douglas enter, preceded by the servants who were carrying the dishes. George barely bowed, but the queen, warned by him not to be surprised at anything, returned his greetings with a disdainful air. Then the servants performed their task and went out as they were accustomed. At last, said the queen, "You're back again, then." George motioned with his finger, went to the door to listen, as if the servants had already gone away, and if no one had remained to spy. Then, returning more at ease, and bowing respectfully. "Yes, madame," returned he, "and heaven be thanked I bring good news." "Oh, tell me quickly," cried the queen, "for staying in the castle is hell." "You know that they came." "You did not, and that they made me sign an abdication?" "Yes, madame," replied Douglas. "But we also knew that your signature had been obtained from you by violence alone, and our devotion to your majesty is increased thereby, if possible. But after all, what have you done?" "The Satans and the Hamiltons, who are, as your majesty knows, your most faithful servants." Mary turned round, smiling, and put out her hand to Mary Satan. "Have already," continued George, "assembled in their troops, who keep themselves in readiness for the first signal. But as they alone would not be sufficiently numerous to hold the country, we shall make our way directly to Dumbarton, whose governor is ours, and which, by its position and its strength, can hold out long enough against all the regent's troops to give the faithful hearts remain to you time to come and join us." "Yes," said the queen, "I see clearly that we shall do once we get out of this. But how are we to get out?" "That is the occasion, madame," replied Douglas, "for which your majesty must call to your aid that courage of which you have given such great proofs." "If I have need only to courage and coolness," replied the queen, "be easy. Neither the one nor the other will fail me." "Here is a file," said George, giving Mary Satan that instrument which judged unworthy to touch the queen's hands, "and this evening I shall bring your majesty cords to construct a ladder. You will cut through one of the bars of this window. It is only 20 feet. I shall come up to you as much as you try it as to support you. One of the garrisons in my pay, he will give us passage by the door. It is his duty to guard, and you will be free. And when will that be? Cried the queen. We must wait for two things, madame, replied Douglas. The first to collect at Kinross and escort sufficient for your majesty's safety. The second, that the turn of night watch of Thomas Warden should happen to be at the isolated doors that we can reach without being seen. And how will you know that? Do you stay at the castle then? Alas, no, madame, replied George. At the castle I am useless, and even a dangerous friend for you. While once beyond the lake, I can serve you in an effectual manner. And how will you know when Warden's turn to mount the guard has come? The weathercock in the north tower, instead of turning in the wind with the others, will remain fixed against it. But how shall I be warned? Everything is already provided for you on the other side. The light which shines each night in the little house in Kinross incessantly tells you that your friends keep watch for you. But when you would like to know if the honor of your deliverance approaches or recedes, in your turn place a light in this window. The others will immediately disappear. Then, placing your hand on your breast, count your heartbeats. If you reach the number 20 without the light reappearing, nothing is yet settled. If you only reach 10, the moment approaches. If the light does not leave you time to count beyond 5, your escape is fixed for the following night. If it reappears no more, it is fixed for the same evening. Then the owl's cry, repeated thrice in the courtyard, will be the signal. Let down your ladder when you hear it. Oh, Douglas, cried the queen, you alone could foresee and calculate everything thus. Thank you 100 times. And she gave him a kiss, her hand to kiss. A vivid red flush the young man's cheeks, but almost directly mastering his emotion. He kneeled down and restrained the expression of that love of which he had once spoken to the queen while promising he never more to speak of it. He took the hand that Mary extended and kissed it with such respect that one could have seen in his action anything but the homage and devotion and fidelity. Then, having to bow to the queen, he went out that a longer stay with her should not give rise to any suspicion. At the dinner hour, Douglas brought, as he had said, a parcel of cord. It was not enough, but when evening came, Mary Satan was to unroll it and let fall the end from the window. And George would fasten the remainder of it A thing was done to rearrange, and without any mishap, an hour after the hunters had returned. The following day George left the castle. The Queen and Mary Satan lost no time in setting about the rope ladder. It was finished on the third day. The same evening, the Queen, in her impatience, and rather to assume herself in her partisans' vigilance, than in hope that in time of her deliverance was so near, brought her a lamp to the window. Immediately, and as George Douglas had told her, the light in the little house in Kinross disappeared. The Queen then laid her hand on her heart, counted up to 22, then the light reappeared. They were ready for everything, but nothing was settled. For a week the Queen thus questioned the light and her heartbeats. Without the number changing, at last, on the 8th day, she counted only as far as 10. At the 11th, the light reappeared. The Queen believed herself mistaken. She did not dare to hope what this announced. She withdrew the lamp, then, at the end of the quarter of an hour, showed it again. Her unknown correspondent understood with his usual intelligence. Then a fresh trial was required of him, and the light in the house disappeared. In its turn, Mary again questioned the pulsations of her heart, and fast as it leaped, before the 12th beat, the propitious stars was shining on the horizon. There was no longer any doubt. Everything was settled. Mary could not sleep all night. This persistency of her partisans inspired her with gratitude to the point of tears. The day came, and the Queen several times questioned her companion to assure herself that it was not all a dream, and every sound it seemed to her that the scheme on which her liberty hung was discovered. And when at breakfast and at all dinner time William Douglas entered as usual, she hardly dared look at him for fear of reading on his face the announcement that was lost. In the evening the Queen again questioned the light. It made the same answer. Nothing had altered. The beacon was always one of hope. For 4 days it thus continued to indicate that the moment of escape was at hand. On the evening of the 5th, before the Queen had counted 5 beats, the light reappeared. The Queen leaned upon Mary Seton. She was nearly fainting between dread and delight. Her escape was fixed for the next evening. The Queen tried once more to obtain the same reply. There was no longer doubt. Everything was ready, except the prisoner's courage, for it failed her for a moment. And if Mary Satan had not drawn up a seat in time, she would have fallen prone. But the first moment over, she collected herself. As usual, she was stronger and more resolute than ever. Till midnight, the Queen remained at the window, her eyes fixed on that star and good omen. At last, Mary Satan persuaded her to go to bed, offering that if she had no wish to sleep, to read her some verse by M. Ronsard or some chapters of Emer des Histories. But Mary had no desire now for any profane reading, and had her hours read, making responses as she would have done if she had been present at a mass said by a Catholic priest towards dawn. However, she grew drowsy, and as Mary Satan, for her part, was dropping with fatigue, she fell asleep, directly in the armchair at the head of the Queen's bed. Next day she woke, feeling that someone was tapping her on the shoulder. It was the Queen, who had already risen. "Come and see, darling," she said. "Come and see the fine day that God has given us. Oh, how alive is nature! How happy I shall be to be once more free among those plains and mountains. Decidedly, heaven is at our side." "Madame," replied Mary, "I would rather see the weather less fine. It would promise us a darker night. And consider that we need is darkness, not light." "Listen," said the Queen. "It is by this we are going to see if God is indeed for us. If the weather remains as it is, yes, you are right, he abandoned us. But if clouds cover, oh, then, darling, this will be a certain proof of his protection. Will it not?" Mary Satan smiled, nodding that if she adopted her mistress's superstition, then the Queen, incapable of rendering idle in her great preoccupation of mind, collected the few jewels that she had preserved, enclosed them in a casket, got ready for the evening in a black dress, in order to be still better hidden in the darkness, and these preparations made, she sat down again at her window, ceaselessly carrying her eyes from the lake to the little house in Kindros, shut up and dumb as usual. The dinner hour arrived, and the Queen was so happy that she received William Douglas with more goodwill than was her wont. And it was with difficulty she remained seated during the time the meal lasted. But she restrained herself, and William Douglas withdrew without seeming to notice her agitation. Scarcely had he gone than Mary ran to the window. She had need of air, and her gaze devoured in advance those wide horizons which she was about to cross anew. A sense of her that once at liberty she would never shut up herself in a palace again, but would wander about the countryside continuously. Then, amid these tremors of delight, from time to time, she felt unexpectedly heavy at heart. She then turned around to Mary Satan, trying to fortify her strength with hers, and the young girl kept up her hopes, but rather from duty than from conviction, but slow as they seemed to the Queen, the hours yet passed toward the afternoon. Some clouds floated across the blue sky. The Queen remarked upon them joyfully to her companion. Mary Satan congratulated her upon them, not on account of the imaginary omen, that the Queen sought in them, but because of the real importance that the weather should be cloudy. The darkness might aid them in their flight. While the two prisoners were watching the billowy moving vapors, the hour of dinner arrived, and it was half an hour of constraint and dissimulation, the more painful that no doubt the return from this sort of goodwill shown him. By the Queen in the morning, William Douglas thought himself obliged, in his turn, to accompany his duties with fitting compliments, which compelled the Queen to take a more active part in the conversation than her preoccupation allowed her, but with William Douglas not seem in any way to observe this absent of mind, and all passed as at breakfast. Directly he had gone to the Queen, ran to the window, and few clouds which were chasing one another in the sky an hour before had thickened and spread, and all the blue was blotted out, to give place to a hue dull, laden as pewter. Mary Stuart's presentiments were thus replied as to the little house in Kinross, which once could still make out in the dusk. It remained shut up, and seemed deserted. Night fell, the light shone as usual, the Queen signaled it. Disappeared. Mary Stuart waited in vain. Everything remained in darkness. The escape for what the same evening. The Queen heard 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock strike successively. At 10 o'clock, the sentinels were relieved. Mary Stuart heard the patrol pass beneath her windows. The steps of the watch recede, and they all return to silence. Half an hour passed away. Thus suddenly the owl cry resounded. Thrice the Queen recognized George Douglas, signaled the supreme moment had come. In these circumstances, the Queen found all her strength revived. She signaled to Mary Satan to take away the bar and to fix the ladder rope. While putting out the lamp, she felt her way into the bedroom to seek the casket which contained a few of her remaining jewels. When she came back, George Douglas was already in the room. All goes well, madame, she said. Your friends await you on the other side of the lake. Thomas Warden watches at the postern, and God has sent us a dark night. The Queen, without replying, gave him her hand. George bent his knee and carried this hand to his lips, but on touching it, he felt it cold and trembling. Madame, he said, in heaven's name, summon all your courage, and do not let yourself be downcast in such a moment. Our Lady of Good Help, murmured Satan, come to our aid. Summons to you the spirit of your kings, your ancestors responded. George, for at this moment it is not the resignation of a Christian that you require, but the strength and resolution of a queen. "Oh, Douglas, Douglas," cried Mary mournfully, "a fortune teller predicted to me that I should die in a prison, and by a violent death. Has not the hour of the prediction arrived?" Perhaps George said, "But it is better to die as a queen than to live in this ancient castle, culminated and a prisoner." "You are right, George," the queen answered. "But for the woman, the first step is everything. Forgive me." Then, after a moment's pause, "Come," she said, "I'm ready." George immediately went to the window, secured the ladder against, and more firmly then, getting up onto the sill, holding to the bars with one hand, he stretched out the other to the queen, who, as resolute as she had been timid a moment before, mounted on the stool and had ready set one foot on the window ledge, when suddenly the cry, "Who goes there?" rang out at the foot of the tower. The queen sprang quickly back, partly instinctively, and partly pushed by George, who, on the contrary, leaned out the window to see whence came this cry, which twice again renewed, remained twice answered, and was immediately followed by a report that the flash of a firearm. At the same moment, the sentinel on duty on the tower blew his bugle. Another set going the cries, to arms," and "Treason, treason," resounded throughout the castle. "Yes, treason, treason," cried Douglas, leaping down onto the room. "Yes, the infamous warden had betrayed us." Then advancing to Mary, cold and motionless as a statue, "Courage, madame," said he, "courage. Whatever happens, a friend yet remains for you in the castle. It is little Douglas." Scarcely had finished speaking when the door of the Queen's apartment opened, and William Douglas and Lady Lochleven, preceded by servants carrying torches and armed soldiers, appeared on the threshold. The room was immediately filled with people and light. "Mother," said William Douglas, pointing to his brother standing before Mary Stuart and protecting her with his body, "do you believe me now? Look." The old lady was for a moment speechless. Then, finding a word at last, and taking a step forward, "Speak, George Douglas," cried she, "speak, and clear yourself at once of the charge which weighs on your honor." Says but these words, a Douglas was never faithless to his trust, "and I believe you." "Yet, mother," answered William, "a Douglas, but he is not just a Douglas. May God grant my old age the strength needed to bear on the part of one of the sons such a misfortune, and the part of the other such an injury," exclaimed Lady Lochleven. "O woman born under a faithful star," she went on, addressing the Queen, "when will you cease to be in the devil's hands an instrument of perdition and death of all who approach you, O ancient house of Lochleven? Cursed be the hour when this Enchantress cross thy threshold. Do not say the mother, do not say that, cried George. Blessed be, on the contrary, the moment which proves that if these are Douglases who no longer remember that they owe to their sovereigns, they are others who have never forgotten it. Douglas, Douglas, murmured Mary Stuart, did I not tell you? And I, madame, said George. What did I reply then? That I was an honor and a duty that it was an honor and a duty to every faithful suspect of your majesty to die for you. Well, die then, cried William Douglas, springing on his brother with raised sword, while he leaped back, drew, and with a moment, quick as thought and eager as hatred, defended himself. But at the same moment Mary Stuart darted between the two young people. Not another step, Lord Douglas, she said. Sheath your sword, George, or if you use it, let be to go hence, and against every but your brother. I still have need of your life to take care of it. My life, let my arm and my honor, is at your service, madame, and for the moment you command it, I shall preserve it for you. With these words, rushing to the door with the violence and resolve which prevented anyone stopping him, back, cried he to the domestics who were barring the passage, make way for the young master of Douglas, or woe to you. Stop him, cried William. Seize him, dead or alive. Fire upon him. Kill him like a dog. Two or three soldiers, not daring to disobey William, pretended to pursue his brother. Then some gunshots were fired, and a voice crying that George Douglas had just thrown himself onto the lake, and has then escaped, cried William. Mary Stuart breathed again. The old lady raised her hands to heaven. Yes, yes, murmured William. Yes, thank heaven for your son's flight. For his flight covers our entire house with shame, counting for his hour. We shall look upon as the accomplices of his treason. Have pity on me, William, cried Lady Lochleven, writing her hands. Have pity on me, William, cried Lady Lochleven, wringing her hands. Have compassion on your old mother. See you do not that I'm dying. With these words, she fell backwards, pale and tottering. The steward and the servant supported her in their arms. I believe, my lord, said Mary Satan, coming forward, that your mother has as much of attention just now as the queen has need of repose. Do you not consider it is time for you to withdraw? Yes, yes, said William. To give you time to spin fresh webs, I suppose, and to seek what fresh flies you can take in them. It is well, go on with your work, but you have just seen that it is not easy to deceive William Douglas. Play your game. I shall play mine. Then turning to the servants, "Go out, all of you," she said, "and you, mother, come." The servants and the soldiers obeyed them. William Douglas went out, last supporting Lady Lochleven, and the Queen heard him shut the door behind him and double lock the doors of her prison. Scarcely was Mary alone, and certain that there was no longer seen or heard, than all her strength deserted her, and sinking into an armchair, she burst out sobbing. Indeed, all her courage had been needed to sustain her so far, and the sight of her enemies alone had given her this courage, but hardly had they gone than the situation appeared before her all is fatal. Hardship dethroned a prisoner without another friend in his impregnable castle than a child to whom she had scarce given attention, and whom was the sole that last thread attaching her past hopes to her, hopes for the future, will remain to Mary Stuart of her two thrones, and her double power, her name, that was all, her name with which free she had doubtless stirred Scotland, but which by little was about to be effaced in the hearts of her adherents, and which during her lifetime oblivion was to cover, perhaps as with a shroud. Such an idea was insupportable to a soul as lofty as Mary Stuart, and to organization which, like that of the flowers, has need before everything of air, light, and sun. Fortunately, there remain to her bestowed beloved of her four Marys, who always devoted and consoling hasten to succor and comfort her. But this time it was easily matter that the Queen let act and speak without answering her otherwise than with sobs and tears, when suddenly looking through the window, to which she had drawn up her mistress's armchair, "The light!" cried she, "Madam, the light!" At the same time she raised the Queen, and with her arm outstretched from the window, she showed her the beacon, the eternal symbol of hope, relighted in the midst of this dark night on Kinross Hill. There was no mistakable possible, not the stars were shining in the sky. "Lord God, I give thee thanks," said the Queen, falling on her knees and raising her arms to the heavens with a gesture of gratitude. "Douglas has escaped, and my friends still keep watch." Then, after a fervent prayer, which restored her to a little strength, the Queen re entered the room, and tired out by her varied successive emotions, she slept in uneasy, agitated sleep, over which the indefatigable Mary Satan kept watch till daybreak. As William Douglas had said, from this time forward the Queen was a prisoner indeed. and permission to go down onto the garden was no longer granted, but under the surveillance of two soldiers. But this annoyance seemed to her so utterly unbearable that she preferred to give up the recreation which surrounded with such conditions became a torture. So she shut herself up in her apartments, finding a certain bitter and naughty pleasure in the very excess of her misfortune. End of chapter 6. This has been Tom Duty, middle aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Duty in a Google search for my site. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, good evening, a restful night's sleep. Ciao.